The Gulfstream G650 touched down on the cracked asphalt of Millbrook Regional Airport at precisely 6:15 in the morning, its sleek white body cutting through the early fog like a ghost from another world. Marcus Ashford unbuckled his seatbelt before the plane had fully stopped, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that comes from 3 sleepless nights and a decision that might destroy everything he'd built. He'd spent the last 48 hours liquidating assets, creating false identities, and constructing an elaborate lie that would either save his family or prove that the world was exactly as cold as he'd always suspected. His 12-year-old daughter Lily hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since the accident that killed her mother, not since the parade of therapists and specialists had failed to reach whatever place she'd retreated to inside herself. His son David, 16 and angry, had been expelled from his 3rd boarding school for fighting, and Marcus knew with terrible certainty that he was losing both of them to a grief he couldn't fix with money or power or any of the tools that had built his empire. The flight attendant, Helen, who'd worked for him for 8 years, gave him a concerned look as he stood. She'd watched him remove his Patek Philippe watch, his Italian leather shoes, his hand-tailored suit jacket, replacing them with items that looked like they'd been purchased at a discount store, which they had been, by his assistant who'd been sworn to absolute secrecy. Marcus had studied YouTube videos on how working-class people dressed, how they spoke, what they worried about, preparing for this performance with the same intensity he'd once applied to hostile takeover negotiations. The plan was simple in concept, impossible in execution. He would disappear into the small town of Millbrook, population 4,700, pretending to be a down-on-his-luck single father trying to rebuild his life, and he would find anyone who could reach his children without knowing there was a $50 million reward waiting if they succeeded. He needed to know if genuine human connection still existed, if someone could care about his kids without the corruption of his wealth, without the performance that everyone in his world had perfected. His therapist had called it an unhealthy paranoid delusion, his lawyer had threatened to quit, and his board of directors didn't know he'd temporarily stepped away, believing instead that he was on a private retreat in Switzerland. Marcus descended the stairs into the cool morning air, carrying a single duffel bag that contained everything his new identity owned, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years, genuine fear mixed with the smallest spark of hope. A rusted Ford pickup truck waited at the edge of the tarmac, arranged through a series of anonymous transactions that couldn't be traced back to him, and as he walked toward it, Marcus Alexander Ashford, billionaire CEO, effectively ceased to exist. In his place was Marcus Reed, a widowed contractor who'd lost his construction business in Seattle and was starting over in a town small enough that people still knew their neighbors' names. The house he'd rented, through more anonymous channels, was a 3-bedroom ranch on Maple Street that probably cost less per month than he usually spent on wine, and his children were being driven there separately by a trusted security team, disguised as a moving company. Lily didn't know anything was different. She rarely seemed to know anything these days, her dark eyes distant and unreachable. David had been told they were trying something new, and he'd responded with the sullen silence that had become his default mode of communication. As Marcus drove the pickup truck through the awakening streets of Millbrook, past the single stoplight, the family-owned diner, the hardware store with hand-painted signs, he felt the weight of what he was attempting settle over him like a physical thing. This wasn't a business deal where he could control the variables, wasn't a negotiation where he held all the leverage. This was surrendering control completely, stepping into unknown territory without the armor of his wealth, and betting everything on the possibility that somewhere in this forgotten town was someone with the pure heart and natural gift to heal what dozens of expensive experts could not. He thought about Emma, his wife, who'd grown up in a town not unlike this one, who'd always accused him of forgetting what mattered, and he wondered if she'd approve of this insane plan, or if she'd laugh at the desperation that had driven him to it. The house on Maple Street was exactly as promised, small, clean, forgettable, with a postage stamp yard and neighbors close enough to chat over the fence, which terrified him more than any corporate raid ever had. As he pulled into the driveway and killed the engine, Marcus allowed himself one moment of absolute honesty. He had no idea what he was doing, no guarantee this would work, and no backup plan if it all fell apart. But his children were dying inside their grief, and he would burn his entire fortune to ash if it meant bringing them back to life, even if that meant pretending to have nothing at all. Marcus had been in Millbrook for 3 days when he walked into Helen's diner, which had nothing to do with his former flight attendant and everything to do with a woman named Helen Kowalski, who'd been serving eggs and coffee in the same location for 40 years. The place smelled like bacon grease and burnt toast and something else he couldn't quite identify until he realized it was the scent of community, of people who gathered in the same place so often that the booths held the impression of their bodies and the staff knew their orders before they spoke. He chose a stool at the counter, because sitting at a table alone felt too exposed, too obvious that he didn't belong, and he'd learnt in his brief time here that small towns noticed everything, catalogued every deviation from normal, discussed strangers with the intensity of scientists examining a new species. The moving truck had arrived on schedule, and the security team had departed without incident, leaving him alone with 2 children who moved through the house like ghosts, unpacking boxes in silence, and he'd realized with growing panic that he had no idea how to be a regular father, had always outsourced the daily mechanics of parenting to nannies and tutors and boarding schools. David had looked at the tiny house with barely concealed contempt and disappeared into his room, and Lily had simply stood in the living room, staring at nothing until Marcus had physically guided her to her bedroom, his heart breaking at how easily she moved wherever directed, like a doll with no will of her own. Now he sat at the counter, trying to figure out how people in this economic bracket ordered food without revealing that he'd never actually looked at prices before, when a voice said, "You're new," and he looked up into the warmest brown eyes he'd encountered in longer than he could remember. The woman holding the coffee pot was probably in her mid-30s, with honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and a face that showed laugh lines around her eyes despite the early hour, and what was clearly a physically demanding job. Her name tag read Sarah, and she was already pouring his coffee without asking if he wanted any, which in his former life would have annoyed him, but somehow here felt like an act of kindness. That obvious. Marcus asked, and he was relieved that his voice came out right, not too polished, not too careful. "Maple Street house, 3 bedrooms, you and 2 kids, Sarah said, setting down the pot. "Moving truck came Monday afternoon. You've been buying groceries at Miller's Market in small batches like you're not sure what you need, and you paid cash for everything, which means you're either running from something or you don't trust banks, maybe both." Marcus felt ice water in his veins, because if she'd noticed this much in 3 days, his entire plan was already compromised. But Sarah just smiled and pulled out her order pad. "Don't worry, everyone gets the full background check when they move here. It's not personal. We're just curious because nothing interesting ever happens in Millbrook and new people are basically our entertainment." She said it so matter-of-factly that Marcus felt himself relax fractionally, and he realized this was exactly the kind of person he'd hoped to find. Observant, warm, integrated into the community in a way that meant she'd notice his children, and maybe, if the universe was kind, care about them. "Just coffee's fine," he said. But Sarah shook her head. "You've got that look people get when they're not taking care of themselves because they're too worried about someone else, probably your kids since you're new and single, and they looked pretty shut down when I saw them at the market yesterday." She leaned on the counter, and Marcus noticed her hands were chapped and calloused, working hands that had seen real labor. "The special is eggs, bacon, hash browns and toast for $6.50. And you're going to order it because you need to eat, and because if you don't order anything I'm going to worry about you, and I've got enough on my plate without adding new people to my worry list." Marcus found himself almost smiling, which felt like a betrayal of everything terrible happening in his life, but also like maybe the first genuine human moment he'd had since Emma died. "You always this pushy with customers?" he asked. And Sarah laughed, a real full sound that made several people at nearby tables look over with affectionate recognition. "Only the ones who look like they're drowning and too proud to ask for help," she said. "I'm Sarah Chen. I've lived here my whole life except for 4 years of college I don't talk about. I work breakfast and lunch shifts 6 days a week, and I have a gift for reading people, which is either blessing or curse depending on the day." She paused, studying him with those warm eyes. "You're running from something painful. You're terrified about your kids, and you're not nearly as broke as you're trying to appear, but that's okay because whatever you're doing, I'm guessing you've got your reason." Marcus felt his carefully constructed cover story crumbling before he'd even used it, but something in Sarah's expression told him she wasn't interested in exposing him, just in acknowledging what she saw. "The eggs sound good," he said quietly, and Sarah nodded like he'd passed some kind of test. "Good choice," she said, turning toward the kitchen, and Marcus, Your daughter was at the library yesterday afternoon, just sitting in the children's section not reading anything, and Miss Patterson, who runs the place, was worried because she didn't respond when spoken to, so you might want to check in there, maybe let them know what's going on so they can help instead of just worrying. She delivered this information while writing down his order, casual as commenting on the weather, and then she was gone, leaving Marcus staring at his coffee and realizing that his plan to slowly integrate into the community and carefully reveal his children's struggles was already obsolete, because Sarah Chen had apparently seen through everything in approximately 90 seconds. Marcus found himself walking to the Millbrook Public Library that same afternoon, driven by Sarah's casual comment and the gnawing guilt that he'd been so focused on his elaborate deception that he'd failed to notice his daughter had wandered off alone in a strange town. The library was a small brick building that looked like it had been constructed in the 1930s, with stone steps worn smooth by decades of feet and a bronze plaque dedicated to someone's beloved aunt who'd left money for books in her will. Inside smelled like old paper and furniture polish, and the particular silence that only libraries possess, a quiet so complete it felt almost sacred. Mrs. Peaton turned out to be a woman in her 70s, with steel grey hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she looked up from her desk with the expression of someone who'd been expecting him. "You must be Lily's father," she said, not unkindly. "She's been here every afternoon since you moved in, always in the same spot, never touches the books, but she doesn't cause trouble either, so I've let her be." Marcus felt something twist in his chest, because in his former life he would have known exactly where his children were every moment, tracked by security teams and nannies and GPS devices, but here in his pretend poverty he'd somehow lost track of the most important thing he had. Mrs. Patterson led him through the narrow stacks to the children's section, a colorful corner with low shelves and beanbag chairs and a mural of fairy tale characters on the wall. Lily sat on the floor with her back against the bookshelf, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at nothing with those dark eyes that looked exactly like Emma's had. She was wearing the same clothes from the morning, her hair uncombed, and Marcus realized with a shock of shame that he didn't know when she'd last eaten. He sat down beside her, not too close, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. This was the paradox of Lily's silence. It demanded you fill it but punished any attempt to do so, and Marcus had watched expensive therapists exhaust themselves trying to find the right words to reach her. "I met someone today who I think you'd like," he finally said, keeping his voice low. "Her name is Sarah, and she works at the diner, and she noticed you at the market yesterday, which means she pays attention, which I think is important." Lily didn't react, didn't even blink, and Marcus continued, because what else could he do? "I know this move has been hard, and I know this house isn't what you're used to, and I know I'm doing everything wrong, but I'm trying, Lily. I'm really trying to figure out how to help you." He wanted to reach for her hand, but remembered the last therapist notes about respecting her physical boundaries, so he just sat there feeling useless and desperate. Mrs. Patterson appeared with 2 cups of hot chocolate, which seemed wildly optimistic but also somehow exactly right, and she set them down between Marcus and Lily without comment. "I lost someone once," Mrs. Patterson said, settling herself into a nearby chair with a soft grunt. "My husband 30 years ago. Cancer took him in 6 months and left me with 3 kids and a mortgage and more grief than I knew what to do with." She wasn't looking at Lily directly, was instead straightening books on a nearby shelf, but Marcus understood she was speaking to his daughter. "For a while I couldn't talk either, couldn't find words for what I was feeling, and people kept telling me to be strong for my kids, and I wanted to scream that I didn't have any strength left." Lily's eyes flickered, just slightly, and Marcus held his breath. "What helped wasn't the talking," Miss Patterson continued. "It was a woman named Dorothy who ran the grocery store, and she'd just put an extra cookie in my bag every week without saying anything, and somehow that little kindness made me feel like maybe the world wasn't completely broken." She finished with the books and looked at Lily directly now. "Your father's trying real hard, honey, and he's scared to death he's going to lose you, and I think maybe that's worth something even if it doesn't fix everything." Marcus felt his throat close up, because this woman he'd never met was somehow saying everything he couldn't, and when he looked at Lily he saw one silent tear tracking down her cheek, the first emotional response she'd shown in weeks. They sat there for another 20 minutes, the three of them not talking, just existing together in that quiet library corner, and when Marcus finally stood to leave, Lily took his hand, her small fingers cold in his palm, and he thought maybe this was what hope felt like, fragile and terrifying, and desperately precious. Walking home as the afternoon sun painted the streets gold, Lily's hand still in his, Marcus thought about Sarah at the diner, who'd seen straight through him, and Miss Patterson, who'd offered wisdom without judgment, and he wondered if maybe his crazy plan wasn't so crazy after all, if maybe there were still people in the world who helped without expecting anything in return. David was sitting on the front porch when they arrived, skateboard beside him, and he looked at their joined hands with an expression Marcus couldn't read. "Where were you?" David asked, and there was accusation in it, but also something else, maybe fear, maybe the same desperate hope Marcus was feeling. "The library," Marcus said. "We met a nice woman named Mrs. Patterson." David's jaw worked like he was grinding his teeth, and then suddenly he was talking, words tumbling out fast and angry. "This place is a dump, Dad. The school is a joke. There's nothing to do. And you won't tell me what we're really doing here, or how long we're staying, or why we can't just go home where everything made sense." His voice cracked on the last word, and Marcus saw that his son was crying. This angry teenager who'd been expelled for fighting was crying on their rented porch in this forgotten town. Marcus sat down beside him, Lily still holding his hand, and he made a decision. "I'm trying to save us," he said simply. "I don't know if it's going to work, and I can't explain all of it yet. But everything we had before, all that money and success and private schools, it wasn't helping, it wasn't bringing you guys back from wherever you went after your mom died." He looked at both his children, these two pieces of his heart that were breaking in different ways. "So I'm trying something desperate and probably stupid, and I need you to trust me just a little longer, and if it doesn't work we'll figure out something else. But please, David, please just give this a chance." Sarah Chen appeared on their porch the next morning at 8 o'clock. Carrying a casserole dish and wearing jeans instead of her diner uniform, which somehow made her look younger and more approachable. "Helen gave me the day off," she announced, "which happens approximately twice a year, and I've decided to spend it being nosy about the mysterious Reed family, because that's apparently who I am now." Marcus had been awake since 5, trying to make breakfast and failing spectacularly, and David had already retreated to his room after a fight about the terrible internet connection, and Lily was sitting at the kitchen table arranging cereal pieces in patterns that probably meant something psychological that Marcus was too tired to decode. Sarah walked past him without waiting for invitation, set the casserole in the refrigerator, and surveyed the chaos of their kitchen with the practiced eye of someone used to assessing disasters. "Okay, so here's what's going to happen," she said, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from Lily. "You're going to come with me today, all three of you, and I'm going to show you around town properly, not the sad version where you wander around lost and everyone watches you through their curtains." She looked at Lily directly. "And you don't have to talk if you don't want to, that's completely fine, but you do have to nod or shake your head when I ask questions, because otherwise I'll just keep guessing, and I'm very annoying when I guess." Lily stared at her for a long moment, and then, miracle of miracles, gave the tiniest nod, and Sarah grinned like she'd won the lottery. "Excellent, we were going to be best friends, I can tell." She turned to Marcus. "Go get your grumpy teenager, tell him I've got unlimited data on my phone's hotspot, and I'll let him use it if he stops acting like the world ended, which I know is harsh, but sometimes teenagers need harsh." David emerged from his room 10 minutes later looking suspicious but interested, and Sarah kept her promise about the hotspot, handing over her phone password like it was nothing, like she hadn't just met these people, like trust was something she gave away freely. They spent the day on what Sarah called the real tour of Millbrook, which meant skipping the official historical markers and instead visiting the places locals actually went: the park where teenagers skateboarded, the hiking trail that led to a swimming hole, the used bookstore run by a gay couple who'd moved from San Francisco and brought sophisticated taste to a town that needed it, the community center that offered everything from yoga to woodworking classes. Sarah talked continuously, filling silence with stories about growing up here, about leaving for college and thinking she'd never come back, about the tragedy that had brought her home and the slow realization that small-town life wasn't the prison she'd thought it was. "My mom got sick my senior year of college," she said as they walked through the park. "Ovarian cancer, stage 4, and I came home to help and she died 6 months later, and suddenly I was 22 and running her diner and taking care of my younger brother, and I hated it, hated every single minute of feeling trapped. She said this while pushing Lily on a swing, gentle pushes that barely moved her, but established a rhythm. But somewhere in all that anger, I noticed that people here took care of each other in ways my college friends never did, like Miss Patterson babysat my brother for free twice a week, and the hardware store owner fixed our walk-in freezer at cost, and Helen Kowalski, the original owner of the diner, taught me everything about running a business before she retired. David was listening despite pretending not to, sitting on a nearby bench scrolling through Sarah's phone but clearly absorbing every word. "So you stayed," Marcus said, and Sarah nodded. "I stayed, and I'm not saying it's perfect, and sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd gone back to finish school, but this place gave me something I didn't know I needed, which was belonging." She looked at Marcus then with those sharp eyes, "Which I'm guessing is what you're looking for, why you picked a random small town and moved your kids here without knowing anyone, because belonging is the thing money can't buy." Marcus felt exposed again but less defensive this time, and he made a decision. "My wife died 9 months ago," he said, and it was the first time he'd said it out loud to someone who didn't know the whole story, who didn't know about the yacht accident and the international headlines and the conspiracy theories. "Car accident, sudden, and my kids haven't been the same since, and neither have I, and you're right, I'm looking for something I don't know how to name." Sarah stopped pushing the swing and came to sit beside him on the bench, and her hand found his shoulder in a gesture of comfort that felt completely natural. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "That's horrible and unfair, and nothing I say will make it better, but I'm still sorry." They sat like that for a while, and then Sarah stood up with characteristic energy. "Okay, here's what I know for sure. Grief is a monster that eats you alive if you let it, and the only thing that helps is other people, specifically other people who give a damn even when it's inconvenient." She looked at all three of them. "So here's my offer, and you can say no without offending me. I'm going to be your person here, the one who checks in and brings casseroles and teaches Lily how to bake and helps David find the decent skate spots and tells you, Marcus, when you're being an idiot, which will be off." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, some defensive wall he'd built crumbling under the assault of her straightforward kindness. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "You don't know us. We could be terrible people. We could disappoint you." Sarah laughed. "Yeah, you probably will disappoint me sometimes. That's how humans work. But I'm choosing to believe you're worth the trouble, and I've got pretty good instincts about people." She held out her hand to Lily, who was still on the swing. "What do you say, kiddo? Want to come see where I learned to make the world's best chocolate chip cookies? My kitchen's way better than your dad." Lily looked at the offered hand for a long time, and Marcus held his breath, and then slowly, carefully, she reached out and took it, and Sarah pulled her off the swing with a gentleness that made Marcus's eyes sting. David stood up, still holding Sarah's phone, and cleared his throat. "The skate spots, are they actually decent or just small-town decent?" he asked, and Sarah turned to him with mock seriousness. "They're legitimately good. There's a half-pipe behind the old warehouse that some kids built 5 years ago and it's held up surprisingly well." David nodded, trying to look unimpressed but failing. "I guess I could check it out." The breakthrough happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Sarah's kitchen, which was small and cluttered, and filled with the kind of cooking equipment that suggested actual daily use rather than decorative aspiration. Marcus had been reluctant to accept her invitation to bring Lily over for baking lessons, paranoid that he was becoming too dependent on this woman's kindness, but David had pointed out with teenage bluntness that sitting in their depressing house wasn't helping anyone, so here they were. Sarah's home was a modest 2-bedroom cottage that she'd inherited from her mother, filled with mismatched furniture and family photos and the comfortable disorder of real life. She'd set up the kitchen counter with all the ingredients for chocolate chip cookies already measured out, and she handed Lily a mixing bowl without preamble. "Okay, so the secret to good cookies is not following the recipe exactly," Sarah said, cracking eggs into the bowl. "You've got to feel it. Add a little extra vanilla, use real butter, not margarine, and never ever skimp on the chocolate chips." Lily stood at the counter in an apron that was too big for her, and she watched Sarah's hands with focused attention, and Marcus realized this was the most present he'd seen his daughter since Emma died. They worked in silence for a while, mixing and measuring, and Sarah kept up a running commentary about nothing important, the weather, the town gossip, a funny thing that happened at the diner last week. She never pushed Lily to respond, never made the silence awkward, just filled it with her comfortable presence. My mom taught me to bake, Sarah said, showing Lily how to roll the dough into balls. She said cooking was love made visible, which I thought was super cheesy when I was a teenager, but now I think she was right. She glanced at Lily. I bet your mom was a good cook too. Lily's hands stopped moving, and Marcus tensed, ready to intervene. But then something impossible happened. Lily nodded, and her mouth moved, and in a voice so quiet it was barely audible, she said, "She made pancakes." The word hung in the air like something fragile and precious, the first words Lily had spoken in 6 months, and Marcus felt tears streaming down his face before he even realized he was crying. Sarah's expression stayed carefully neutral, like she'd been expecting this, like she knew that making a big deal would shatter the moment. "Pancakes are the best," Sarah said, continuing to roll dough like nothing extraordinary had happened. "What kind, regular or chocolate chip?" Lily was quiet for another long moment, and Marcus thought maybe that was it. One word was all they'd get. But then she said, "Blueberry," and her voice was stronger this time, more certain. "Her specialty, with real maple syrup." Sarah nodded seriously. "A woman of excellent taste, your mom. We'll have to make those sometime. I've got a killer blueberry pancake recipe." They finished making the cookies together, and Lily spoke 3 more times, short sentences about mixing techniques and baking temperature, and each word felt like a miracle that Marcus was terrified to examine too closely in case it vanished. When the first batch came out of the oven, filling the kitchen with the smell of sugar and vanilla and chocolate, Sarah put one on a plate for Lily and said, "These are for you and your mom wherever she is, because I think she'd be proud of you right now." Lily took the cookie and bit into it, and tears started rolling down her cheeks, not the silent single tear from the library but real crying, shoulders shaking, making sounds of grief that Marcus had been waiting months to hear. Sarah pulled her into a hug without hesitation, this woman who'd known them for less than a week, and she just held Lily while she sobbed, murmuring things Marcus couldn't hear, and he stood there feeling helpless and grateful in equal measure. Later, after Lily had cried herself out and was sitting at Sarah's kitchen table eating cookies with a glass of milk, looking exhausted but more present than she'd been in half a year, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah on her back porch. "Thank you, doesn't even begin to cover it," he said, his voice rough from his own tears. "I don't know what you did or how you did it, but thank you." Sarah leaned against the porch railing, looking out at her small backyard. "I didn't do anything special, Marcus. I just showed up and paid attention and gave her space to be whoever she needed to be." She turned to look at him. "Your daughter's not broken. She's grieving, and grief needs time and safety and people who won't force you to be okay before you're ready." Marcus wanted to tell her everything then, wanted to confess that he was a billionaire playing pretend, that he'd orchestrated this entire scenario to find someone like her, that he'd been testing her kindness to see if it was real. But the words stuck in his throat because what if the truth changed everything? What if knowing about his wealth made her treat his children differently? And wasn't that the whole point of this exercise? To find authentic connection untainted by money. "You're thinking too hard," Sarah said, and she smiled. "I can literally see your brain working. Whatever you're worried about, stop it." She poked his shoulder. "Here's what I know. You're a good dad who's trying his best. Your kids are hurting but they're strong, and sometimes the universe sends people exactly when you need them, which sounds like hippie nonsense, but I've seen it happen enough times to believe." She went back inside before he could respond, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and his guilt and the sound of his daughter laughing at something Sarah said, actual laughter, light and genuine, and the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. David came around the corner then, skateboard under his arm, looking sweaty and more relaxed than Marcus had seen him in months. "The half-pipe's actually pretty sick," he said, sitting down on the porch steps. "Met some guys, they're not total losers." He picked at his shoelace. "Sarah's pretty cool, I guess, for an old person." Marcus laughed. "Despite everything, she's 34, that's not old." "Whatever, she's cool," David said, and then his expression shifted to something more vulnerable. "Lily talked. I heard her through the window. She actually talked." His voice cracked. "Does that mean she's going to be okay? Does that mean we're going to be okay?" Marcus sat down beside his son and put his arm around his shoulders, and for once David didn't pull away. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think maybe we're heading in the right direction, and that's something." The house of cards started collapsing on a Friday evening when Marcus opened the door to find his corporate attorney, Richard Chen, standing on the porch in a $3,000 suit, looking completely out of place in Millbrook. Richard's expression was tight with barely controlled anger, and he pushed past Marcus without invitation, dropping a leather briefcase on the coffee table with a thud that made both David and Lily look up from the television. "We need to talk," Richard said, and his voice had the clipped precision of someone who'd driven 4 hours to deliver a lecture he'd been rehearsing the entire way. Now, privately, Marcus felt ice in his veins because Richard's presence meant something had gone wrong with the carefully constructed barriers he'd placed around his real identity, and he looked at his children who were watching this interaction with growing confusion. "Kids, go to your rooms for a minute," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, but David was already standing up with that suspicious expression that meant he'd figured out something was happening. "Who is this guy, Dad? Why does he look like he's about to fire someone?" David's eyes narrowed. "Why is he wearing a suit that probably costs more than our rent?" Marcus opened his mouth to answer, but Richard cut him off. "Your father isn't who he's been pretending to be," Richard said, and Marcus felt everything he'd built crumbling in real time. "His name isn't Marcus Reed, it's Marcus Ashford. And he's not a broke contractor, he's a billionaire who's been playing dress-up for the past month while his company nearly implodes without him." The silence that followed was deafening, and Marcus watched David's face cycle through confusion, realization, and then pure rage. Lily had gone completely still again, that terrible stillness that meant she was retreating back inside herself, and Marcus wanted to scream at Richard for destroying everything, but he knew this was his own fault. His own arrogance in thinking he could maintain this lie indefinitely. "That's not true," David said, but his voice wavered. "That's insane. We're broke. We lost everything. Dad told us we had to start over." He looked at Marcus, desperate for denial. "Tell him he's crazy, Dad. Tell him he's wrong." Marcus closed his eyes because he couldn't watch his son's heart break. "He's not wrong," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry. But he's telling the truth." The sound David made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and then he was moving, grabbing his skateboard, heading for the door. "David, wait," Marcus called, but his son was already gone, slamming out into the evening, and Marcus turned on Richard with fury. "You had no right to come here, no right to tell them like that. We had an agreement about discretion." Richard's laugh was bitter. "Our agreement went out the window when the board discovered your absence and started asking questions I couldn't answer, when your disappearing act started costing the company millions in frozen deals and spooked investors." He pulled papers from his briefcase. "You need to sign these. You need to appear at the emergency board meeting Monday, and you need to end whatever midlife crisis this is before you destroy everything your father built." Marcus looked at the papers without seeing them, his mind on David running through the streets and Lily frozen on the couch and Sarah, who he'd been planning to tell the truth to eventually, on his own terms with explanation and context. "Get out," Marcus said. "We'll talk tomorrow. I'll sign whatever you need, but right now you need to leave before I do something we'll both regret." Richard studied him with something that might have been pity. "You always thought you could control everything, Marcus, manipulate variables until you got the outcome you wanted. But people aren't business deals, and this little experiment of yours was doomed from the start." He left the papers on the table and headed for the door, pausing on the threshold. "That woman from the diner, Sarah Chen, she's my cousin, and when she finds out what you've done, how you've used her kindness and manipulated her into helping your kids, it's going to destroy her, because Sarah's superpower is believing the best in people, and you've just proven that's a weakness." He was gone before Marcus could process that information, leaving behind papers and accusations and the ruins of everything Marcus had tried to build. Lily was still on the couch, staring at nothing, and when Marcus sat beside her, she flinched away from his touch. "Lily, honey, I can explain," he started, but she shook her head, the most animated she'd been all evening. "You lied," she said, her voice barely audible, "about everything. You lied just like you lied about Mom, about how she died, about why we really moved." Marcus felt like he'd been punched. "What are you talking about? Your mother died in a car accident." "That was true." Lily looked at him, then with eyes that held more pain than any child should carry. "I heard you on the phone before we moved, talking to someone about the yacht, about the accident on the yacht, about how the media couldn't know the truth." She was crying now, silent tears that tracked down her face. "I know Mom died on your stupid yacht. I know you lied about how it happened, and I stopped talking because if I talked I'd have to say it out loud and make it real." The world tilted sideways because Marcus had been so careful, had constructed the car accident story to protect his children from the horror of what had actually happened, their mother drowning when the yacht caught fire, trapped below deck while he'd been on a business call and hadn't noticed until too late. The guilt of it had nearly killed him, and he'd buried the truth along with his wife, buying silence from everyone involved, creating a simpler narrative for his children. Lily, I was trying to protect you, he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. I thought if you didn't know the details, if you could imagine it was quick and painless, it would hurt less. Lily stood up, her small body rigid with anger. You thought wrong, and now you've lied again, about who we are, and why we're here, and I don't know what's real anymore. She walked to her room with that careful precision, and the door closing behind her sounded like a cell door locking. Marcus sat in the empty living room, holding papers he couldn't read through his tears, and he thought about Richard's parting shot about Sarah, and he realized with sick certainty that everything was about to get worse before it could possibly get better. Sarah appeared at his door at 7 the next morning, and Marcus knew from her expression that Richard had already told her everything. She wasn't wearing her usual warm smile, wasn't carrying any casseroles, or offering friendly banter, and her eyes held a fury that made him step back involuntarily. Is it true? She asked, her voice controlled but shaking. Are you actually Marcus Ashford, the billionaire Marcus Ashford who owns half the tech companies on the West Coast? Marcus wanted to lie, wanted to offer some explanation that would soften the blow, but he'd done enough lying. Yes, he said simply. It's true. Sarah's laugh was sharp and painful. Richard called me last night, my cousin Richard, who I haven't spoken to in 5 years, because we had a falling out about his corporate lawyer bullshit, and he called to tell me I'd been played by one of his clients, that the sad, broke single dad I'd been helping was actually a billionaire, running some kind of social experiment. She pushed past him into the house. Tell me he's wrong, Marcus. Tell me there's some explanation that makes this okay. Marcus closed the door, aware that neighbors were probably watching, that in a town like Millbrook this confrontation would be the talk of the community within hours. I can't tell you that, he said. Richard's right. I've been lying about who I am, and I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so deeply sorry. She turned on him with blazing eyes. Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. You used me, you manipulated my kindness and my genuine concern for your kids to see if poor people have real human emotions, if we're capable of caring without ulterior motives. Her voice broke. I brought you into my home. I opened my heart to your children. I shared my grief about my mother with you, and it was all part of some twisted test. Marcus felt something in him crack because hearing it laid out like that made him see how monstrous his actions had been. It wasn't like that, he tried. I was desperate. My kids were dying inside their grief, and I thought if I could find someone who cared about them for who they were rather than what they represented, someone who wasn't corrupted by my wealth, maybe they could heal. Sarah shook her head. You don't get it, Marcus. You don't get to decide that everyone around you is corrupted by wealth. You don't get to test people's authenticity by lying to them about fundamental aspects of who you are. She wiped angry tears from her face. I told you about my mother, about choosing to stay in Millbrook, about learning to find meaning in a small life, and you let me share all of that, while knowing you were playing pretend, while knowing you could return to your billions whenever you wanted. She looked at him with something close to hatred. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? How violated and stupid and used? Marcus reached for her, but she jerked away. I wasn't playing pretend about caring, he said desperately. Everything I felt, every connection we made, that was real, Sarah. My feelings for you are real. She laughed bitterly. You don't even know what's real anymore, Marcus. You've been lying so long you've lost track of the truth. She looked around the small house. This place, this life you've been pretending to live. Do you know how many people in Millbrook actually struggle with poverty? How many families can barely afford rent, can't get their kids proper health care, worry constantly about money? Her voice rose. And you've been playing dress up in their reality, like it's some kind of game you can quit whenever it stops being interesting. The door to Lily's room opened, and both children emerged, drawn by the shouting, and Sarah's expression softened fractionally when she saw them. I'm sorry you two are caught in the middle of this, she said, her voice gentler, and I want you to know that everything I felt for you was real. I genuinely care about you both, But your father's actions have consequences, and I can't pretend they don't. She looked at Lily. Those cookies we made, that breakthrough you had, that was real, honey. That was you finding your voice, and I'm proud of you. David stepped forward, his face hard. So you're just going to abandon us because my dad made a mistake? You're going to punish us because he lied? His voice shook. You said you'd be our person here. You said you'd check in and help us. Was that all dependent on us being actually broke? Does it only count if we're poor enough to deserve your charity? Sarah flinched like she'd been slapped, and Marcus saw the hit land, saw her recognize the uncomfortable truth in David's accusation. That's not fair, she said quietly. It's not about you being broke or rich. It's about your father lying to me, manipulating me, treating me like a variable in his experiment. David's expression was pure teenage contempt. So you're exactly like everyone else then? You're going to treat us differently now that you know about the money, which is exactly what my dad was afraid of, which means he was right about people all along. He grabbed his skateboard. Congratulations, you just proved that authenticity doesn't exist and everyone's motivated by money. That's going to be really helpful for my sister who just started talking again. He stormed out, leaving Sarah standing in the living room looking stricken, and Marcus hated himself for putting her in this position, for creating a situation where there were no good choices. He's not wrong, Marcus said quietly. I did what I did, because I've seen people change when they find out about my wealth. I've watched genuine friendships become transactional. I've seen people treat my kids like lottery tickets rather than human beings. He met her eye. And yes, I should have told you the truth sooner. And yes, I understand why you feel betrayed. But I need you to understand that my fear wasn't irrational paranoia. It was based on years of experience watching money poison everything it touches. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was tired. Maybe you're right, Marcus. Maybe everyone in your world is corrupted by wealth. But you don't get to apply that assumption to people you've never given a chance to prove otherwise. She headed for the door. I need time to think about this, to figure out if I can separate my anger at you from my care for your kids, and I don't know what the answer's going to be. She paused on the threshold. But I'll tell you this, Lily talked because she felt safe, because she was given space to grieve without pressure, and that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with human connection, so maybe consider that before you decide everyone's hopeless. The town turned on him within 24 hours, which Marcus supposed was fair given what he'd done. Mrs. Patterson from the library stopped speaking to him when he came to pick up some books. Lily had left behind, her expression cold and disappointed. The hardware store owner who'd been friendly refused to serve him, suggesting he take his business elsewhere, preferably back to whatever mansion he'd crawled out of. Helen at the diner told him he wasn't welcome there anymore, that Sarah had enough troubles without dealing with his manipulative games. David had disappeared again, and this time Marcus knew better than to go looking for him, knew his son needed space to process the betrayal. Lily had retreated back into her silence, more complete than before, and she flinched whenever Marcus tried to approach her. The words she'd spoken in Sarah's kitchen felt like a dream now, something that had happened to different people in a different life. Richard had returned that morning with more papers, and the news that the board was threatening to remove Marcus as CEO if he didn't return immediately, that his absence had created a power vacuum that others were eager to fill. Marcus had signed everything without reading it, his mind on his children and Sarah and the wreckage of his stupid plan. You should come back to Seattle, Richard said, his tone gentler than before. Cut your losses here, admit this experiment failed, get the kids back into therapy with actual professionals. He paused. I know I was harsh yesterday, but Marcus, you can't fix everything, and you especially can't fix things by lying to people about who you are. Marcus stared at the papers he'd signed, documents that would stabilize his company, protect his fortune, maintain the empire he'd built. What if I don't want to go back? He asked. What if I've realized that empire isn't worth having if my kids hate me, and I can't trust anyone around them? Richard sat down heavily. Then you're going to have a very expensive breakdown, because whether you like it or not, you have responsibilities, people depending on you, shareholders and employees, and contracts that don't care about your personal crisis. He rubbed his face. I'm not unsympathetic, Marcus. I know you're in pain. I know losing Emma broke something in you, but you can't run away from your life by pretending to be someone else. They sat in silence for a while, and then Marcus asked the question that had been eating at him. Sarah, is she going to be okay? Her cousin, your cousin, I didn't know about the family connection. I swear I didn't deliberately target her because of it. Richard's expression was hard to read. Sarah's tougher than she looks. She'll recover, but you hurt her badly. Marcus and Sarah doesn't let people close very often, so when she does and they betray her trust, it cuts deep. He gathered his paper. For what it's worth, I think she genuinely cared about your kids, and if you'd just been honest with her from the start, she probably would have helped anyway, because that's who Sarah is. That possibility haunted Marcus through the rest of the day as he tried and failed to reach his children, as he packed up the rental house, as he made arrangements to return to his real life. Had he destroyed something genuine by refusing to trust? Had his paranoia about wealth corrupting people become a self-fulfilling prophecy? He was sitting on the porch steps at dusk, watching the streetlights come on one by one, when he saw Sarah walking toward him. She wasn't moving with her usual energy, looked tired and sad and older than her 34 years, but she kept coming until she stood at the bottom of his steps. I've been thinking, she said without preamble, about what David said about me treating you differently because of money, and I realized he was partially right, which pisses me off. She sat down beside him, careful to maintain distance. I am treating you differently now that I know about your wealth, but not in the way you expected. I'm not suddenly being nicer or asking for favors or trying to get something from you. She looked at him. I'm treating you with less grace than I would someone who actually needed help, and that's not fair either, because rich people have problems too, and grief doesn't care about bank accounts. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. You have every right to be angry. I lied to you. I used your kindness. I treated our friendship like it was part of some experiment, and I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorrier than I know how to express. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Here's what I keep coming back to. Your fear about people being corrupted by wealth isn't crazy. I've seen it happen. I've watched my cousin Richard turn into someone I barely recognize, because he got caught up in corporate culture and money and power. She picked at a loose thread on her jean. But your response to that fear, lying about who you are, testing people's authenticity while hiding your own truth, that's not okay either, because you don't get real connection through deception. She turned to face him fully. So here's what I need from you. If we're going to figure this out, I need complete honesty from here forward. No more games, no more tests, no more pretending. Her voice was firm. And I need you to understand that my caring about your kids has nothing to do with your money. That Lily's breakthrough happened because she felt safe, not because you successfully fooled me into thinking you were poor. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. I can do that, he said. Complete honesty, no more deception, and acknowledgement that you helped my children because you're a remarkable person, not because my manipulation was successful. He took a breath. The truth is, I've been falling in love with you since the first morning in the diner, and that terrified me because I didn't think I deserved it. Didn't think I was capable of genuine feeling anymore after Emma died. Sarah's expression softened fraction. That's a lot to drop on someone during an apology, she said, but there was the smallest hint of humor in her voice. And for the record, I've been developing feelings too, which made finding out about your lies feel even more like a betrayal. She stood up. But we're not going to figure this out tonight, and your kids need you more than I do right now, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to find David and Lily and have an honest conversation with them about everything, about their mother's real death, about why you moved here, about your wealth and your fears, and your failures. She held out her hand to pull him up. And then tomorrow, after you've done that hard work, we're going to talk about what happens next, about whether there's a path forward that includes both your real life and this community you've accidentally become part of. Marcus took her hand, let her pull him to his feet, and felt hope for the first time in days. Thank you, he said, for not giving up on us, for being angry but still showing up, for being exactly who you are. Sarah smiled, tentative, but real. Don't thank me yet. We've got a lot of hard conversations ahead, and I'm not promising anything except that I'm willing to try. She squeezed his hand once and then let go. Now go find your kids, and be the father they need you to be, the honest version, not the one hiding behind lies and money and fear. Marcus found his children at Mrs. Patterson's house, which surprised him until the elderly librarian explained that David had shown up an hour earlier, asking if they could stay there because they couldn't be in the rental house with their lying father. Mrs. Patterson had made hot chocolate and called Marcus despite David's protests, and now she was giving him a look that said he'd better not waste this chance. They gathered in the rental house living room, this space that had witnessed both breakthrough and betrayal, and Marcus sat on the floor facing the couch, where his children perched like refugees from a disaster, which he supposed they were. "I'm going to tell you everything," he started, "the complete truth about your mother's death, about why we moved here, about my wealth and my fears, and all the lies I've told, and it's going to be hard to hear, but you deserve to know." He took a breath. "Your mother didn't die in a car accident. That was a lie I told to protect you from something I thought was worse." Lily's face crumpled, but she didn't tet, and David's jaw was set hard, but Marcus continued. "She died on our yacht. There was an electrical fire while we were hosting a corporate event, and she was trapped below deck before anyone realized what was happening." His voice broke. "I was on a business call on the upper deck. I was so focused on some deal that I didn't notice the smoke until it was too late. Didn't hear the alarms over my own voice talking about profit margins and market share." The tears came now, unstoppable. "By the time I got to her, she was already unconscious from the smoke, and the fire department said even if I'd noticed immediately it might not have made a difference, but I'll never know that for sure, will I?" David was crying openly now, and Lily had pulled her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. "Why didn't you tell us?" David asked, his voice raw. "Why make up a car accident? We had a right to know how our own mother died." Marcus nodded. "You did have that right, and I took it from you because I was ashamed, because I couldn't face telling you that I was so absorbed in work that I failed to protect the most important person in our lives." He looked at both of them. "I lied because I was a coward, because admitting the truth meant admitting my failure, and I thought if I could control the narrative, make her death seem random and unavoidable, maybe you wouldn't blame me the way I blamed myself." Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "I heard you on the phone, heard you paying people to keep quiet, to make the yacht disappear, to create the car accident story." She looked at him with those dark eyes. "I thought maybe you killed her, maybe it wasn't an accident, and that's why I stopped talking, because if I talked, I might say that out loud and then someone would take you away too." The horror of that revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Oh God, Lily, no, baby, no. It was an accident, a terrible, tragic accident that I should have prevented but didn't cause deliberately." He moved closer but didn't taunt. "I paid people to keep quiet because the media was turning it into a spectacle, because reporters were harassing you kids, because I wanted to protect you from the circus it was becoming. But I swear to you, I swear on your mother's memory, I didn't hurt her." David spoke then, his voice shaking. "But you did hurt her, Dad. Maybe not directly, but your work was always more important than us, than her, and she told me once that she felt like she was competing with your empire for your attention." He wiped his face angrily. "The night she died, she'd asked you to skip the event to have a family dinner instead, and you said the business meeting was too important, so yeah, maybe you didn't start the fire, but you chose work over her one more time, and that time she died because of..." The truth of those words settled over the room like ash, and Marcus had no defense because David was right. Emma had asked him to skip the event, had said they needed family time, and he'd dismissed her concerns, promised they'd do something special the next weekend. A promise he'd never kept because there was no next weekend. "You're right," Marcus said. "I did choose work over family consistently, and your mother died partly because of those choices, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life." He looked at his children, these two people he loved more than anything. "And that's why I did this insane thing, moving here and lying about who we are, because I realized that my wealth and my work had poisoned everything, had taken your mother and was now taking you too, and I was desperate to find out if there was another way to live." He explained it all then, the decision to pretend to be broke, the hope of finding someone who could reach them without the corruption of his wealth, the theory that authentic human connection could heal what expensive therapy could not. He told them about watching them through reports from security teams but never really seeing them, about the moment he'd decided that his billions were worthless, if his children were lost to greed. "I thought if I could strip away all the wealth and privilege, if we could live like normal people, maybe we'd find something real," Marcus said. "And it worked, didn't it? Lily, you talked for the first time in 6 months because Sarah made you feel safe, not because of money or therapy or medication, but because she genuinely cared." He looked at Dave. "And you made friends here, real friends who liked you for who you are, and I saw you smile, actually smile for the first time since your mother died." David's expression was complicated. Yeah, and then you destroyed it all by lying, by making everything fake, so what was even the point? His voice rose. Those friends probably hate me now, think I was part of your sick experiment. And Lily stopped talking again. So congratulations, Dad. Your plan worked great. Marcus flinched but accepted the anger. You're right, I destroyed what we'd built by maintaining the lie too long, by not trusting that the connections we'd made could survive the truth. He met David's eye. But the connections were real, son. Sarah genuinely cared about you both, and I think with time and honesty she might again, and your friends liked you for who you are, not for my money, so that part was authentic even if the foundation was a lie. They talked for hours, crying and arguing and slowly, painfully, beginning to understand each other. Marcus told them about the guilt that ate at him every day, about lying awake wondering what he could have done differently, about the moment he'd decided his company and his wealth meant nothing if he couldn't save his children. Lily spoke more than she had in months, asking questions about her mother, about that last night, about what Emma had said and thought and felt. David raged about being lied to, about feeling manipulated, but underneath the anger, Marcus could see the hurt of a kid who just wanted his father to be honest. I don't know if I can forgive you, David finally said as exhaustion set in. Not yet, maybe not for a long time, but I understand why you did it, even if I think it was stupid and wrong. He looked at his sister, and I think Sarah helped Lily, because she's a good person, and maybe we shouldn't waste that just because you messed up. Lily nodded slowly. I want to go back to Sarah's house, she said quietly. I want to make cookies again, and talk about Mom and feel like someone understands. She looked at Marcus. But I need you to promise no more lies, Dad, even when the truth is hard, even when you think you're protecting us. No more lies ever. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some fundamental realignment of priorities. I promise, he said, complete honesty from now on, even when it's hard, even when it hurts. No more lies. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood outside Helen's diner at 7 in the morning, his children on either side of him, and for the first time in months he wasn't pretending to be anyone other than exactly who he was, a flawed man who'd made terrible choices, but was trying to do better. Sarah had agreed to meet them for breakfast, after a series of long phone conversations, where Marcus had been completely honest about everything, his wealth, his company, his failures as a husband and father, his desperate hope that they could find a way forward. She'd listened without judgment, asked hard questions, and finally said she was willing to try if he was willing to do the work. The diner was half full with the usual breakfast crowd, and heads turned when they walked in, conversations pausing as people took in the sight of Millbrook's infamous fake broke guy with his kids. Marcus met their stares steadily, no longer hiding, no longer pretending, and he nodded to Mrs. Peterson, who was sitting in a corner booth reading the paper. She nodded back, which felt like forgiveness or at least the possibility of it. Sarah was already seated at their usual booth, wearing her diner uniform, and looking nervous but determined, and when she saw them she smiled, tentative but genuine. They slid into the booth, Marcus and David on one side, Lily beside Sarah, and for a moment nobody spoke, the weight of everything that had happened hanging in the air. So, Sarah finally said, I have some ground rules if we're doing this. She looked at Marcus. First, you pay for breakfast at the actual price, no ridiculous tips that are really guilt money in disguise. Second, we take this slow and see how it goes without any pressure or expectation. Third, you tell your kids the truth about us, about the fact that we're trying to figure out if there's something here, but it's complicated and messy. Marcus nodded, agreed to all of it. He looked at his children. Sarah and I have feelings for each other, but we're taking it slow because trust takes time to rebuild, and the priority is making sure you guys are okay with whatever happens. David shrugged with teenage nonchalance that didn't quite hide his interest. Whatever, as long as you don't get weird about it. He looked at Sarah. You're cool, and you helped Lily, so I guess if you want to date my disaster of a father, that's your choice. Sarah laughed. High praise from a 16-year-old. She turned to Lily. What about you, sweet? How do you feel about your dad and me spending time together? Lily considered this seriously. I think Mom would like you, she said quietly. She always said Dad needed someone who wouldn't let him get away with his workaholic stuff, and you seem like you'd call him on. Her voice got stronger. And I like you, and I want to keep making cookies and talking, so if that means you and Dad are dating or whatever, that's okay with me. They ordered breakfast, and Marcus pulled out his wallet to pay with a credit card that had his real name on it, Marcus Ashford, and Sarah took it without comment. The food came, and they ate and talked, and slowly the conversation found a natural rhythm. Sarah told them she'd been offered a job managing 3 diners in the county, a promotion that would mean real money and benefits, and she was considering taking it. David talked about the skate competition he was entering next month, and how his Millbrook friends had stuck by him even after finding out about his family's wealth, which had surprised and moved him. Lily described the art therapy classes Miss Peterson had recommended, and how drawing her feelings was helping when words weren't enough. Marcus talked about his company, about the decision he'd made to step back from daily operations and hire a CEO to run things while he focused on being present for his children. The board wasn't happy, he admitted, but I realized Richard was right. I can't be the father my kids need while running an empire, and between the two, the choice is obvious. He looked at his children. I'm keeping the wealth. I'm not going to pretend away, but I'm changing how I relate to it, making it serve our life instead of consuming it. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, a gesture witnessed by half the diner and which would undoubtedly be the subject of intense discussion later. That takes courage, she said. Walking away from that kind of power, choosing your family over your empire, not many people could do that. Marcus squeezed her hand. I should have done it years ago. Maybe Emma would still be alive if I had, but I can't change the past, only learn from it and do better. They finished breakfast as the morning sun streamed through the windows, and when they stood to leave, Marcus saw that Miss Peterson was watching them with an expression of approval, and the hardware store owner gave him a slight nod, and Helen herself came out from the kitchen to tell Lily she'd saved a special cookie recipe for their next baking session. Walking out into the bright morning, Sarah's hand in his and his children beside him, Marcus felt something he'd forgotten was possible, hope mixed with genuine peace. The path forward wouldn't be easy. He'd have to navigate his wealth, while maintaining the authentic connections they'd built, would have to earn back trust he'd carelessly destroyed, would have to learn how to be present instead of always planning the next move. But Sarah squeezed his hand and Lily was humming something under her breath, actual music, and David was telling them about a new trick he'd learned on his skateboard, and Marcus thought maybe this was what healing looked like, messy and incomplete and beautiful in its imperfection. Thank you, he said to Sarah, as they walked toward her car, for giving us, another chance. Sarah smiled. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth, even when it cost you everything. She looked at his children. And thank you too for being willing to forgive your dad's mistakes. That's not easy. Lily slipped her hand into Sarah's. Can we make those blueberry pancakes this weekend? The ones my mom used to make. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. Absolutely, we'll make them together, and we'll tell stories about your mom while we cook, because she deserves to be remembered. Marcus watched his daughter and this remarkable woman who'd somehow become essential to their healing, and he thought about Emma, about what she'd say if she could see them now. He hoped she'd approve of Sarah, hoped she'd understand that moving forward didn't mean forgetting, hoped she'd forgive him for all the ways he'd failed her while she was alive. The future was uncertain, full of complications about wealth and authenticity and how to build a real life when you had billions in the bank. But standing there in the parking lot of Helen's diner with his children and the woman he was falling in love with, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd figure it out together. The sun climbed higher, painting Millbrook in gold, and Marcus Ashford, no longer pretending to be anyone else, took his first real steps toward a life built on truth instead of deception, on connection instead of control, on love instead of the lonely isolation his wealth had created. It wasn't the ending he'd planned when he'd landed his private jet at that small airport weeks ago, but it was better, more real, and worth every difficult moment it had taken to get here.